Welcome to the DESE F&S Pre-K Meal Pattern webinar. In this webinar, we're going to be discussing the Pre-K meal pattern, which is a little bit different than the regular National School Lunch Program meal pattern. And we're going to be discussing when that meal pattern must be served and what the requirements of that meal pattern are. So with the Pre-K meal pattern, you are required to serve all Pre-K students the Pre-K meal pattern, also known as CACFP, if you are not commingling your Pre-K students with other grades. So we do have the flexibility available if you are commingling your Pre-K kids with other grades. Our definition of commingling is if your Pre-K students are eating in the same location at the same time as another grade. So if your Pre-K kids are in the lunchroom at the same time as your kindergarten and first grade kids, for example, and they're both eating at the same time for lunch, then they would be commingled for lunch. However, if your Pre-K kids for breakfast are served in their classroom separate from all other grades, they would not be commingled for breakfast. And it is possible for you to be commingled for one meal service and not the other. So make sure you look at those different meal services individually and are determining if your Pre-K kids are commingled for either or before you decide if you can follow the National School Lunch or School Breakfast Program meal pattern or if you have to serve the Pre-K meal pattern. And if you do have questions about whether your Pre-K kids are considered commingled or not, please give us a call and we'd be happy to kind of discuss through the specifics of your situation. So the requirements of the CACFP Pre-K meal pattern are that juice may be offered no more than once per day. So if you offer your Pre-K kids juice at breakfast, you would not be allowed to offer them juice at lunch or vice versa. At least one serving of grains per day must be whole grain. With the new National School Lunch Program requirement that only half of your grains for the week need to be whole grain rich, you would for the National School Lunch Program not be required to have a whole grain item every single day. However, with CACFP Pre-K meal pattern, you would be required to have a whole grain every day. For CACFP, grain-based desserts cannot count towards the grain component requirement. You can offer them, however, they cannot count towards that grain ounce equivalent that has to be served each day. They would be offered as an extra. And for CACFP, the meat alternate component may be served in place of the entire grain component at breakfast up to 3 times per week. So in the National School Lunch Program, that is not allowed. You must serve a grain component before you can count your meat alternate component at breakfast. However, you are allowed to not serve a grain every day for the Pre-K meal pattern at breakfast. A couple of other differences that fall under the CACFP Pre-K meal pattern are that yogurt must contain no more than 23 grams of sugar per 6-ounce serving. Cereal must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. When it comes to milk varieties, Pre-K students ages 2 to 5 can only have unflavored, fat-free, or low-fat milk as their milk variety options. Flavored milk is not allowed to be served to Pre-K students. And for 1-year-olds, unflavored whole milk is the only allowed milk variety. And also, if you have any infants in your Pre-K facility, infants who are breastfed on-site directly can be claimed as a reimbursable meal. However, we don't see this a lot in Pre-Ks that are part of a school district. So there are a couple other differences when it comes to meal service options under the Pre-K CACFP meal pattern requirements. Under CACFP, offer versus serve is not an option for Pre-K students. Instead, USDA encourages schools to implement family-style meal service. However, this is not a requirement. Family-style meal service allows children to serve themselves from common dishes of food with assistance from supervising adults as needed. Under the family-style meal service in the school meal programs, preschoolers must take at least a quarter cup of vegetable or fruit. In addition, while family-style meal service allows children to make choices on selecting foods, the supervising adult should initially offer the required minimum serving size of each food component or food item to each student. However, since replenishment is going to be immediately available at each table, the initial serving of a food component or food item can be less than the full required minimum quantity. But the serving adult should encourage additional portions and selections to make sure that that full required minimum serving size is appropriate for that child. If you're not implementing family style, students must take all of the components in the required quantities in order for the meal to be reimbursable, just like with National School Lunch Program. If you're not doing an offer versus serve system, then they need to take the required minimum component requirement. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the lunch quantities that are required for the pre-K students in the CACFP meal pattern. For children ages 1 to 5, at lunch, each student must receive 1 ounce of meat alternate. You'll notice that this is not listed as an ounce equivalent. That's because for the meat alternate, we measure this simply by ounces, not in ounce equivalents like we do for National School Lunch Program. So children ages 1 to 2 need to receive 1 ounce of meat alternate, half an ounce equivalent of grains, an eighth a cup of fruit, an eighth a cup of vegetable, and half cup of milk daily. And then children ages 3 to 5 must receive 1.5 ounces of meat alternate, a half ounce equivalent of grains, a quarter cup of fruit, a quarter cup of vegetable, and 3/4 cup of milk. Now, please remember that these are the minimum daily requirements, so you can exceed these amounts. Just make sure that you're not going too above and beyond these requirements, because these are kind of the recommended. Also, please note that a vegetable may be used to meet the entire fruit requirement. So when you have only when you have 2 vegetables served at lunch. So if you're using a vegetable to meet the entire fruit requirement, you would need to have 2 different servings of vegetables in order to accomplish that. Okay, so moving on to our breakfast quantity requirements. So for students ages 1 to 2, at breakfast, they must receive a half ounce equivalent of grain daily, a quarter cup of fruit and or vegetable, and a half a cup of milk. And then children ages 3 to 5 need to receive a half ounce equivalent of grain, a half a cup of fruit and or vegetable, and 3/4 cup of milk. And then just remember that the meat alternate component, which isn't required, could be offered in place of the grain requirement at breakfast up to 3 times per week. So up to 3 times each week you could go without serving a true grain item if you were serving a meat alternate in place of that grain component. Okay, and then the snack requirements for ages 1 to 2 are a half ounce of meat alternate, a half ounce equivalent of grain, a half a cup of fruit, a half a cup of vegetable, and a half a cup of milk. For students ages 3 to 5, that requirement is going to be exactly the same. Please note that with the snack requirements, you're only required to serve 2 of the 5 components in order to have a reimbursable snack. You can serve more than this, but you need to serve at least 2 of these. Whereas with breakfast and lunch, all of the required components must be offered in order for that student to have a reimbursable meal. And that concludes the webinar on our pre-K meal pattern. If you have any questions about pre-K or the requirements of that meal pattern, please give us a call. We would be happy to help you. Hey, thank you.